Hello and welcome to another episode of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Melissa Whitecross, joining you all from a rather chilly Johannesburg. Winter is certainly into full swing on the Highveld, so I hope if you are in the Gauteng region that you are keeping nice and warm. And based on our chat feed comments this evening, it seems like other parts of the sub-region are also rather chilly, so stay warm out there, everybody. Tonight, we are thrilled to have one of South Africa's top ornithologists joining us to share his research into the unpredictable future facing our birds in the arid landscapes of South Africa as global temperatures heat up. But before we hear from Professor Andrew McKechnie, please remember that you, our audience, can communicate with us using the Zoom chat room, and questions to our speaker this evening can be posted into the Q&A box throughout the webinar. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, you can use the comment feed for your comments and questions, and Andrew will answer these at the end of the webinar. If you'd like to get in touch via our social media channels, please use the hashtag Conservation Conversations. All of our previous episodes are available on our BirdLife South Africa YouTube channel, as well as our podcast. We'd like to ask all of you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel to help us grow support for these webinars. Tell your friends to subscribe too, and we're almost at that 1,000 subscriber threshold, so please do encourage everyone you know to sign up. BirdLife South Africa is proud to produce this weekly webinar series, but it does not run without its costs. If you are enjoying conservation conversations and have found this content interesting and entertaining, why not consider dropping us a small donation towards our ongoing efforts to bring you new and exciting content that is free for all to learn and enjoy. Simply scan the Cricut QR code on your screen now, or visit our Conservation Conversations website to find the link to the donations tab. A big thank you to everyone who has continued to support these webinars so far. BirdLife South Africa's Conservation League donor competition is back, and all existing and new members who join our organization as Conservation League donors before the 31st of August 2021 will be entered into the draw to win a 4-night stay at Zamanga Private Game Reserve in northern KwaZulu-Natal for 2 people. Show your commitment to giving conservation wings and win. You can contact our membership team to find out more. And now on to some of our upcoming events. We're gearing up for our virtual African Bird Fair, which is returning to your screens this year. It's set to take place on 30 and 31 July. Be sure to watch BirdLife South Africa's media channels to find out more. Registrations for this event are opening very soon, so keep your eyes peeled on those announcements. Tickets are almost sold out for our BirdLife South Africa annual jackpot competition, so be sure to stand your chance to win a 100,000 Rand cash prize with an additional 3 prizes valued at 10,000 Rand each. Entry into this draw is only 500 Rand, and all proceeds are going towards giving conservation wings. So be sure to bag your chance to win this exciting prize by visiting the BirdLife South Africa website. Finally, an in-person event. BirdLife South Africa is excited to advertise our weekend bush breakaway with eco-training in the Makuleke concession. Situated in the northern extreme of Kruger National Park, Makuleke is considered one of the best, if not the best, birding locations in South Africa, with specials like racket-tailed roller, Pell's fishing owl, Arno's chat, and 3-banded courses. Those of you who watched Joe Grossel's incredible talk on Mapungubwe last week would have gotten a little bit of an insight into this northern region. So I'd highly recommend signing up for the weekend of 13 to 16 August, as bookings are now open. It'll only cost you 5,400 Rand per head for 3 nights, and this is inclusive of all board and lodging and the activities that you will undertake. For bookings and inquiries, please email projects@ecotraining.co.za. Now, we need to let you all know that our Cycle in the Bush event has had a slight change of plans given the continued COVID-19 pandemic and the associated lockdowns abroad. Unfortunately, Phil Liggett will no longer be hosting the event. However, the team have managed to secure Stephen McGowan, who will join the ride and share his incredible story of surviving abduction by Al-Qaeda in Mali, where he was held hostage for almost 6 years in the Sahara Desert. He is the longest surviving hostage of Al-Qaeda to date, and will share this incredible story of survival, resilience, and determination with all of the attendees on the ride. To book your spot in September 2021, please email lindsay.smith@birdlife.org.za. Now, lastly, tomorrow night at 7 p.m, I will have the privilege of hosting author and naturalist Doug Newman as we virtually launch his revised book on Southern Africa's LBJs Made Simple, which is published by Straight Nature for Penguin Random House. To register for this exciting launch, you can hit the link, which I will post in the chat box momentarily. But now onto our main event for this evening. Tonight, we are really excited to host an incredible South African academic who has made it his life's mission and work to research and understand the threat that a warming world poses to our feathered friends, particularly those in the arid lands of the Kalahari Desert region. Professor Andrew McKechnie obtained his PhD at the University of Natal before conducting 2 years of postdoctoral research in New Mexico. This was followed by a 4-year stint at my alma mater, Wits University, where I just missed him upon starting my own BSc journey in 2008. And that is when Andrew started a position at the University of Pretoria's Zoology and Entomology Department, where he has remained ever since. In 2017, he was awarded the South African Research Chair in Conservation Physiology at SANBI, which is hosted by the University of Pretoria. Andrew's major research focus lies in avian physiology within the context of global heating on arid-zone birds. He has trained 15 PhD students and 19 MSc students, with over 130 scientific papers published to date. Andrew is also the scientific advisor to the African BirdLife magazine, and we are greatly thankful to him for his contribution in keeping our magazine scientifically accurate. He was elected an honorary fellow of the American Ornithological Society and a fellow of the Royal Society of South Africa. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us tonight to share your insights into what global heating means for Southern Africa's birds. I am personally very excited to hear this talk this evening, and I'm going to now hand over to you to share your amazing presentation with all of us.
Well, Melissa, thank you for that very generous introduction, and thanks also to you and Andrew and Christina and the rest of the team for coordinating what I think is an absolutely wonderful webinar series. You should be able to see my first slide right about now.
We can. Thank you, Andrew. You can take it away.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's a real privilege to be able to contribute to this conservation conversation series by talking about some of the work that my colleagues and students and I have been doing in the Hot Birds Research Project. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about for the next 45 minutes or so. Let me start by introducing the team behind the work that I'm going to be talking about. The Hot Birds Research Project started in late 2009 as a collaboration between the University of Cape Town and the University of Pretoria. And at that stage, the team consisted of the late Professor Phil Hockey, this rather youthful version of tonight's speaker, and a team of 4 researchers based at Tswalu: Ben Smith, Susie Cunningham, Rob Sutcliffe, and Rowan Martin. Ben has gone on to an associate professorship at Rhodes University, and Susie, of course, is at the Fitzpatrick Institute. She's a senior lecturer there, and she's been co-leading the Hot Birds project since Phil's untimely death in 2013. Those of you who attended the science lab 2 weeks ago will no doubt remember Susie's fantastic plenary on the morning of day 1. This is how things look a decade later, 2 years ago. We're now a team of 20 people, and we have a network of collaborators that spans several North American, European, and Australian universities. Okay, so this is more or less what I'm going to cover in the next 45 minutes. I'll start with a little bird ecology 101 and say something about life in very hot environments from the perspective of birds that live there. After that, we're going to take a whirlwind tour of how hot weather affects birds, starting at moderate temperatures and moving all the way up to some of the highest air temperatures on Earth. Then in the last part of the talk, I'll place these effects of hot weather into the context of the global heating that's really happened in the last couple of decades and the substantial increases in temperature predicted for the rest of this century. Let's talk about hot environments, of which deserts are an obvious example. This is the Black Mountain Conservation Area outside Aggeneys, a little town between Springbok and Pofadder in the Northern Cape. And this is one of the best known sites for seeing RedLocks, for the very good reason that the larks are very common here. Now, for any bird, this is a harsh environment. Air temperatures in midsummer are regularly in the upper 30s and sometimes the lower 40s. The dark red color of the sand means that surface temperatures in midsummer, when the sun's directly overhead, might reach 70 degrees. And as you can see, there is not much in the way of shade available at all. Despite all this, RedLocks managed to survive here without drinking water ever, and eke out an existence based on a primarily insectivorous diet in summer, from which they obtain all the water they need to survive. But make no mistake, these larks are living right on the edge. If you find yourself in this landscape on a summer's morning, initially the lark activity is quite high, larks foraging and displaying all over the place. But then as the temperatures increase, sometime around mid-morning, they just vanish. Where they disappear to is the shade of these rather scraggly shrubs. This video I'm going to play in a moment was recorded by Reino Kemp, who's currently completing a PhD on the species. And this was filmed on a very hot day. And at the time the footage was recorded, the air temperature was 39 degrees Celsius. Okay, so there are a couple of things to notice here. First of all, the lark has scratched away this sort of hollow in the sand, and it's pressing its underparts into close contact with the cool sand a centimeter or two below the surface. You'll notice that its eyes are closed most of the time anyway, which I think is simply a way to reduce evaporation from the moist surfaces of the cornea. And it's also gaping intermittently, so allowing some evaporation to take place in order to keep cool. But the take-home message from this video really is that this is a very tough place for a lark to live. And on a daily basis, they have to put a lot of effort into reducing heat gain and avoiding heat stroke and dehydration by seeking shelter in the cooler spots that they can find. Thermal landscapes, or landscapes of heat if you want, play a massive role in driving the ecology of desert birds. For the red lark, for example, the thermal landscape basically consists of this sea of high temperatures, high surface temperatures on the sand, with this vegetation sort of analogous to small islands of cooler temperature, provided by the shade. If we move into arid savannas, like the Kalahari, the presence of trees adds a new element to these thermal landscapes in which birds operate. Red larks have basically got a choice between on the bare sand or under a shrub. But in this kind of environment, there are a few more options for birds to use. This is a diagram I've borrowed from Susie, and what it shows is the black bulb temperatures. So in other words, these are temperatures that we measured with small copper spheres painted black in 4 different microsite categories that are potentially available to birds in this environment. And these temperatures were measured on an afternoon in summer when the air temperature was 30. And what's really important to notice here is just that the range of temperatures. As you'd expect, the exposed sand is brutally hot, in this case 65 degrees, but temperatures in the shade, particularly off the ground under the canopy, are much lower. And so birds can select these different microsites based on their thermal properties. And that's something we're going to spend a lot of time looking at a little bit later in the talk. So thermal landscapes determine many of the behavioral decisions that desert birds make and affect many aspects of their ecology, as we're going to see. But the other thing I want to mention is that landscapes of heat are not the only issue. The risk of predation also varies tremendously across a landscape. And so birds also have to navigate what ecologists refer to as landscapes of fear. Now, this video shows a female rufous-cheeked nightjar returning to her eggs after a short bout off the nest at midday, 35 degrees Celsius at a site near Kimberley, Dronfield, just north of Kimberley. And this is one of many examples of desert birds that nest in completely exposed locations where they bear the full brunt of the sun from sunrise to sunset. Of course, many larks and shorebirds do this too. From a thermal perspective, it would make a lot more sense to nest in shaded sites under vegetation. But the problem is that that vegetation is where you're going to find every mongoose, snake, and other would-be nest predator. And so many desert birds have evolved this breeding behavior where they nest in these incredibly exposed sites where they have to handle these very high temperatures, but they can reduce the predation risk. So whether breeding is successful under these conditions depends very much on the temperature, and breeding attempts during cooler parts of the year often tend to be more successful than during hotter parts of the year. Another context in which landscapes of fear and landscapes of heat are likely to intersect is at waterholes, like this one in Malorpo Nature Reserve. Now, of course, anyone who's been to the Kgalagadi Transfrontier Park will know full well that waterholes are very risky places for birds like sandgrouse and doves, just because of the number of raptors and jackals and so forth that are hanging around. So that's pretty much the end of the first part of my talk. And the take-home message so far is that birds in hot environments like deserts operate in these intersecting landscapes of heat and landscapes of fear. The exact same is true for more mesic places like Kruger Park, but of course there the greater amount and the more varied nature of vegetation makes these thermal landscapes much more complex. We're actually in the process of starting a project with SANBI at the moment to start looking at these more complex thermal landscapes in southern Kruger and how birds use them. Now we can move into the second part of the talk, which is going to involve a whirlwind tour of the ways in which hot weather affects birds. Before starting, however, I just want to take a quick detour into some basic concepts of how birds keep their body temperature within physiologically tolerable limits. I'm going to use a Burchell sandgrouse as an example, and during the day, a Burchell sandgrouse maintains a body temperature of 39 degrees Celsius. So that's kind of the optimal body temperature for physiological processes in this species. Now, to understand how a sandgrouse responds to body temperature going above that set point or below that set point, a really good analogy is to think of a room with an air conditioner installed. And the air conditioner is connected to a thermostat, which is set at some comfortable temperature in the room. Now, if the temperature of the room or the body temperature of our sandgrouse increases above that thermostat's set point temperature, then the cooling circuit on that air conditioner, if you want, is going to kick in and dissipate heat to the environment. In the case of the sandgrouse, this cooling circuit consists of mechanisms like panting, seeking shade, wing drooping, and other behaviors intended to offload heat. And so the sandgrouse's body temperature gets returned to the set point in the same way that our room's temperature would get returned to the set point, at which point the heating circuit of the aircon would switch off. Conversely, of course, if the temperature of the sandgrouse drops below the set point, then the reverse is going to happen, and we're going to see the aircon's heating circuit turned on, which in this case involves metabolic heat production through shivering primarily. And that would then return the body temperature back up to the preferred temperature, the sort of thermostat temperature for this sandgrouse. And so much of the rest of this talk is going to be focusing on these heat dissipation mechanisms and the limits to environmental temperature at which this cooling circuit can still keep body temperature below lethal limits. For most birds, body temperatures above 45 to 46 are almost invariably lethal, although there are a couple of very interesting exceptions to that. Now let's start our tour of how hot weather affects birds. Now, there's a multitude of ways in which birds are affected by high temperatures, and this is really what much of the Hot Birds work is focused on in the last decade. When preparing this talk, I decided that the best way to cover this is going to be by starting at moderate air temperatures and working our way all the way up the thermometer to progressively higher temperatures. So I'm going to include this attempt at a thermometer on the next 13 or so slides, so you can tell at a glance what temperatures we are dealing with. I'm going to start at air temperatures around 25 or 26 degrees, because this is where some species, like the southern ground hornbill, start panting and retreating to shade. So these heat dissipation mechanisms can kick in at quite low temperatures. In fact, they can even kick in at lower temperatures than 25. And there's some very interesting examples of heat dissipation mechanisms that are not even observable to the naked eye. In the last decade, it's become clear that many birds use their beaks to offload heat during hot weather. And 2 years ago, we teamed up with Lucy Kemp and the Mabula Ground Hornbill project and used a thermal imaging camera to investigate the importance of the beaks of these magnificent birds for keeping them cool. And just before continuing, I really must take this opportunity to congratulate Lucy on her recent Whitley Award. This is a truly remarkable achievement that recognizes the fantastic work that she and her team are doing with the ground hornbills. But back to beaks. Although you might not guess it, beaks actually have a very well-developed network of blood capillaries beneath the outer surface. And it turns out that many, and quite possibly all birds, can very precisely regulate blood flow to those capillary beds. And so the beak can serve as a sort of heat radiator, and species with disproportionately large beaks, like hornbills, toucans, etc., can offload substantial amounts of heat via the beak. Now, these three thermal images here were taken at 15 degrees, air temperature of 15 degrees Celsius, air temperature of 25, air temperature of 30. And at 15 degrees, the temperature of the beak is only about 2 degrees above that. All right, so what this tells us is that at an air temperature of 15 degrees, this ground hornbill has shut off the blood supply to its beak. And for that reason, the surface of the beak is very similar to the background temperatures. But look at this picture at 25 degrees. Now, all of a sudden, beak temperature is close to 10 degrees above air temperature. And what's happened here is that the hornbill has opened those circulatory valves and flushed warm blood into the beak, into the capillaries of the beak. And the beak is now functioning as a heat radiator. So we see these heat dissipation mechanisms starting to kick in even at quite low temperatures. In the ground hornbill's case, as soon as air temperature is above 20, they switch on this beak heat radiator and use that process to cool down. Cranking up the heat into the mid-30s upper 30s, many things start happening. And a lot of the hot birds work is focused on this particular range of temperatures. Let's come back to the shepherd's tree you've already met and the variation in temperature in these different microsites in and around the tree. And I'm going to use two species common in the Kalahari to illustrate some of the rather tough decisions that birds have to make at these temperatures approaching 40. So the first example, and again, I've borrowed liberally from Susie's slides here, but since this is her work, I don't feel too bad. The first example is the southern fiscal. Fiscals forage by perching on exposed branches where they get a good view of this and then swoop down to catch prey, whether it's large insects, small reptiles, even occasionally small mammals. But on a hot day, air temperatures combined with this intense solar heat load result in high temperatures in these exposed microsites. And the fiscals are basically forced to retreat under the canopy to shaded perches. They pay a price for that, and the price that they pay is that their view of the surroundings is reduced. And so their foraging efficiency, the number of prey items they catch per hour, declines rapidly as soon as they retreat to these shaded perches. Second example, southern ground hornbill, and obviously these two are not to scale in this slide. Hornbills primarily forage on exposed grounds out here, but these are the sites that get so intensely hot, and the hornbills have no choice really but to retreat to shade and also into these off-ground shaded locations where their foraging efficiency drops precipitously. So this really is what ornithologists mean when they use the term trade-off. When it gets too hot to forage in exposed locations, birds are forced to make a decision between risking heat stroke in the sun while foraging or retreating to the shade, but at the cost of much less food being acquired per unit time. Trade-offs between foraging and behaviors have far-reaching and consequential effects. While Reino was working on RedLocks at the study site at Aggeneys, he used a technique that had earlier been perfected with southern pied babblers by Mandy Ridley from the University of Western Australia. And what Reino did was he habituated the larks and got them to the point where they learned to hop onto an electronic scale in return for a small food reward. So you can see this mealworm over here that provides the lark with the incentive to hop onto the scale. The screen's over here, and off camera to the left is a video camera focused on that screen. So then after the bird has jumped on, we can just review the footage and see precisely what it weighed. So using this technique, Reno weighed the birds twice a day, first thing in the morning before they started foraging, and then again last thing in the evening before they retired to their roosts. And using this data, he was able to produce this figure here. So we've got daily maximum air temperature on the x-axis, and what we've got on the y-axis is the percentage of mass that each lark gains between sunrise and sunset. So there's the 0 line. Anything above 0 means that the larks are gaining mass during the day. But there's this strong negative relationship between diurnal mass gain and maximum daily air temperature. So on relatively cool days in the lower 30s, these larks are on average are gaining maybe 5 or 6% of body mass during the daylight hours while they forage. But on very hot days, that is dropping to 0, and in the case of several individuals, well below 0. And so we can, okay, before I get to that, the other important information here is this line. And what this line shows is the average overnight mass loss. So this relationship is for diurnal mass gain, and this line is for overnight mass loss, which remains at a constant 5% or thereabouts, irrespective of how hot each day is. And so this means that we can start to identify ecologically important threshold temperatures for the species. At about 34 degrees, on average, the mass gain during the day is exactly the same as the mass lost overnight. And so for every 24-hour cycle, the net change in body mass is going to be 0. This point here is a bit more serious because now, on average, daytime mass gain is going to be 0. And so for every 24-hour cycle, the lark is going to lose about 5% of body mass. And we'll get back to this towards the end of the talk. So we see very similar effects of maximum air temperature on body mass in other species, including the Kalahari population of southern yellow-billed hornbills that Tanya van defended her PhD on a couple of years back. Here's one of her male hornbills on a perch scale that allowed us to weigh the males whenever they arrived in a nest box to provision food to the females and the chicks. And when Tanya plotted that same relationship you just saw for RedLocks for the hornbills, the same pattern emerged, also with a threshold temperature in the mid-30s. But Tanya's work also revealed some very strong negative effects of hot weather on breeding success. So what this graph shows, again, we've got the mean daily maximum temperature during the nesting period over here. And this is the probability of fledging a chick. So these are successful nesting attempts where at least one chick was fledged. These are unsuccessful nesting attempts where no chicks were fledged. And first thing to notice is that no breeding attempts at a mean maximum air temperature of 38 and above during the breeding season were successful. If you fit what's called a logistic regression line to these data, you can then identify the threshold temperature at which breeding success drops below 50%. And of course, that's a fundamental thing for a population, because if your breeding success is below 50%, you cannot sustain that population. And so again, we've got this really important threshold temperature in terms of daily maximum air temperatures coming out in this mid-30 range. Tanya also found a very strong effect, a concerningly strong effect, in fact, of temperature on the mass of fledgling hornbills when they leave the nest. So during cooler breeding seasons, or when breeding attempts coincided with cooler periods, the birds were leaving the nest with a body mass of 200 to 250, so very close to adult body mass. But look what happens during these very hot periods. These three individuals here left the nest weighing, in one case, half of what they would normally weigh. And such small fledglings have very little chance of survival. And in fact, all three of these individuals, as far as I know, were killed by predators within 24 hours of leaving the nest. So you see these effects on body mass maintenance, on breeding success, and on the likelihood of fledglings actually surviving once they leave the nest, all driven by hot weather. I've given you two very specific examples, the RedLocks and the yellow-billed hornbills, but Susie and her team have now found similar effects of very hot weather on body mass or important aspects of breeding success in virtually every we've looked at so far. So the picture that's emerging from this work is that these effects of temperature are very widespread among birds, and many species have ecologically important threshold temperatures somewhere in this 35 to 40 degree. It also turns out that temperatures in this range are literally stressful for birds. Lesedi Moahi, who recently completed a BTech in nature conservation, has just published a paper in which he shows that stress hormones in southern pied babblers remain approximately stable on days cooler than 38 degrees, but then increase rapidly on days hotter than that. She worked with a habituated population of the babblers at Kuruman River Reserve near Van Sailsrus and used a really nice technique that involves collecting droppings from the birds and then measuring the concentration of molecules in the droppings that mirror the concentrations of stress hormones circulating in the babblers' bloodstreams. So completely non-invasive, doesn't involve catching the birds, handling the birds in any way. These results are important because they provide the first evidence, of which I'm aware, that desert birds perceive very hot days as stressful. And these results, I think, also just remind us perhaps that global heating, in addition to being a massive conservation issue, is also very much an animal welfare issue. You know, birds are increasingly experiencing conditions that they find stressful. And of course, you have all kinds of negative effects associated with stress, which are being, the risks of which are being increased by progressively warmer temperatures. Okay, now we get to temperatures around 40. And at this point, things change rapidly. From 40 degrees upwards, resting birds have to keep their body temperature below that of the surrounding environments. And there's only one way that they can do that, and that's by evaporating water to keep cool. Probably the most best known mechanism whereby birds do evaporate water is panting. The other mechanisms too, but the point is that as soon as environmental temperature is above a bird's body temperature, the only way it can keep its body temperature below lethal limits is through evaporative cooling. To illustrate, this is a graph that shows evaporative water losses. Don't worry about the units as a function of environmental temperature. And what's important here is that at moderate and low environmental temperatures, evaporative water loss is pretty much flat. But then as soon as the environmental temperature goes above the bird's body temperature at around 40, you see this massive linear increase in evaporative water loss rates, mainly driven by panting. And by the time you get to 48, this bird is evaporating water at about 7 times the rate that it was at these low temperatures. Now, the problem with this is that this means this verdin is evaporating about 5% of his body mass per hour. And obviously, you're not going to be able to do that for very many hours before you become lethally dehydrated. Really strong trade-off in these, in these very hot conditions between conserving body water by keeping evaporative water loss rates low and avoiding hypothermia or heat stroke by dissipating heat to keep cool. Once birds or other animals are in this 40-degree plus space, things can get very dramatic very quickly, particularly in places with high relative humidity. The last 2 decades have seen rapid increases in the frequency of die-offs of fruit bats, flying foxes in Australia. And the air temperature above which mass mortality events start occurring in these fruit bats is 42 degrees. The most concerning of these flying fox heat-related mortality events in the last decade happened in November 2018, when 2 days above 42 degrees was sufficient to wipe out 1/3 of Australia's entire population of spectacled flying foxes. Let me say that again. 1/3 of an entire species population on the Australian continent was wiped out in 2 days of extremely hot weather. Even Sir David Attenborough mentioned this particular event in his excellent documentary, Climate Change: The Facts. And this is really our first glimpse so far in this evening's talk into the potential of heat waves to extirpate large fractions of a population in a matter of hours on extremely hot days. I mean, you lose a third of a population of the species, you've got trouble. And these are the events that are becoming more and more frequent among these flying foxes in Australia. For an example of what can happen at temperatures between 43 and 45, we unfortunately no need to look beyond South Africa's borders. In the first week of November last year, maximum air temperatures in the town of Pongola reached the upper 30s on several days, and then spiked right up to 43 degrees on the 8th of November. Here is the an air temperature trace on this particular day, on the 8th of November. And what's really noteworthy is that temperature was above 40 by about 11 o'clock, and it remained above 40 until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So at least 5 hours with air temperatures above 40. This dashed line indicates relative humidity, which doesn't look like it, but it's actually fairly high compared to the conditions that desert birds further west would experience. On this day, on the same day, field rangers in the nearby Pongola Nature Reserve started noticing dead and dying birds. After the worst of the heat, the rangers conducted a search of an area equivalent to about 45 hectares, or about 1% of the surface area of the reserve. The rangers found 44 carcasses belonging to 13 species, with blue waxbills accounting for around 20 of the victims. Nearly all of the dead birds were passerines or songbirds. This cardinal woodpecker was one of only 3 non-passerines that succumbed to the heat. Now, this is a very sobering milestone for me and the rest of the Hotbirds team, simply because it's the first time a major heat-related mortality event has been documented among non-domesticated birds in South Africa. There have been, several occasions when ostriches have dropped dead from extreme heat outside Oudtshoorn on farms, but this is the first case I know of wild birds succumbing in a major heat-related mortality event. All right, now we get into the upper 40s, and this is where things can get very frightening indeed. These are budgerigars that succumbed to temperatures around 48 degrees in January 2009, about 500 kilometers north of Perth in Australia. And obviously many thousands of budgies seem to have succumbed during this event. A year later, similar temperatures wiped out 210 Carnaby's black cockatoos in a matter of hours in the very southwestern corner of Western Australia. And the cockatoos are a red-listed species, so again, you've got a significant fraction of the population just being eliminated in a matter of hours on a very hot day. Right, 50 degrees. This is a temperature higher than I've ever experienced, notwithstanding what my car's thermometer occasionally tells me. In January 1932, temperatures around 50 triggered a mortality event in this part of Australia that can best be described as cataclysmic. Now, to give you some perspective, this area is roughly equivalent to the Free State and Northern Cape provinces of South Africa combined. And multiple accounts of mortality on a vast scale were sent to a local ornithological journal. And together they paint a picture of bird deaths numbering well into the millions. To give you a sense of what these reports to the South Australian ornithologist contained, here are a couple of quotes from 2 reports. The first pair are from a well-known Australian naturalist, Herbert Finlayson. The second pair are from a farmer called Neil McGilp, who described the deaths of thousands of budgerigars, or shell parrots as they were then called, that had drowned while desperately trying to drink in water reservoirs. I'll just give you a second or two to read these quotes. This is by far the worst avian mortality event during extreme heat that I've ever read about or heard of. And these quotes really make for very sobering reading in this rapidly warming world in which we find ourselves nearly a century later. Even higher temperatures do sometimes occur, and their frequency does seem to be increasing. In late July 2018, Death Valley experienced 3 consecutive days with maximum temperatures of 53 degrees Celsius. The area also set a new record for the highest average temperature during a month, 42.3 degrees. So this is not an average daytime maximum temperature. It is an average temperature, an overall average of all nighttime and daytime temperatures during July 2018. It's difficult to imagine conditions quite as hot as that. All right, so we're at the top of the thermometer, and that brings to an end the second part of the talk, where I've just given you an overview of the different ways, the multitude of ways in which hot weather can affect birds. And this brings us now to the third and final part of the talk. Where is avian diversity headed? What does the future hold? I suspect many of you have seen a graph, something like this at some point. This is a figure from the last UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report published in 2018. And in this case, the y-axis is the difference between average global temperature and the average value between 1986 and 2005, a bit counterintuitive. Basically, these are temperatures relative to this period over here. And the point really is simply that over the last few decades, Earth has been getting warmer fast. I suspect many of you have also seen a graph something like this, which shows the various trajectories of climate change forecast for the next 80 years. The climate predicted for the year 2100, which children born this year will very well live to see, depends almost entirely on how we act in the next decade or two. If we rapidly decarbonize economies, in-century climate will be within a degree or two of what it is now. However, if we continue along a business as usual approach and continue powering human civilization using coal and oil, and maybe take the view that climate change is the Chinese hoax, then by 2100, average global temperatures are going to be between 3 and 5 degrees hotter than they are now. And this is just not something that we want to do to the planet. But let's take a look at the climate change that's already occurred. These are weather data for Tueriferin, going back to the 1960s. And what I've plotted here is the number of days per year on which the maximum temperature was above 35. And recall that 35 is where you see these threshold temperatures for RedLocks, yellow-billed hornbills, and a host of other species. Between the mid-90s and now, the frequency of days above 35 at Tueriferin has increased from an average just below 90 up to around 130. While on the topic of sandparks, here's a graph showing the number of days above 40 in Skukuza going back to the 1960s. And I should just mention these data that are indicated as gaps in the data are simply years where the recordings were interrupted. There were data for some days missing. And so what this means is that in these cases, these numbers are a minimum estimate of the number of days above 40. They could have been more frequent. But you get the picture. And just thinking back to what happened in Pongola at an air temperature of 43, this increase in frequency in days above 40 is a really concerning thing. I'm also going to take a look at Australia. The difference between Australia and South Africa is that you can download data for any Australian weather station for free, which is not the case here, unfortunately. And what I did a couple of weeks back was I picked 7 arid-zone sites more or less at random. And in each of these graphs, the y-axis is the number of days a year above 40 degrees. Mikatara, this is a town that shared the SKA with Carnarvon. I think some of the units are installed here. And there's been a linear increase in the frequency of these hot days over the last century. Same thing for Halls Creek up here in the Northern Territory. Marble Bar, no significant trend. And this is the pattern that you see worldwide, whether you're looking at North America, Australia, Southern Africa, wherever. The majority of sites are showing obvious warming, but there are a couple that are remaining stable. But they're very much the minority. Although in the case of Marble Bar, it could be argued that a place that occasionally experiences 140 days above 40 a year, it's difficult to imagine it getting much hotter. Alice Springs, same thing. And I think what this really emphasizes is that you're also seeing this increase in variability at many sites. You know, you can see the same thing to a smaller extent here and here. Compare the variability a century ago to the variability now. Then we see a couple of stations like Tarcoola, where instead of a linear increase over the last century, there was a gradual increase until some sort of inflection point in the 80s or 90s. And since then, there's been a much more rapid increase. Same thing for Wilcannia in New South Wales, and same thing for Birdsville in the very southwestern corner of Queensland. So again, the picture that comes out when you start looking at multiple weather stations is that the majority of them, not all of them, but certainly most, are showing these rapid increases in the frequency of very hot days. What these data utterly unusual the Australian heatwave of December 2019 was. Some of you might recall that in December 2019, Australia was struck by a truly ferocious heatwave, which set the scene for the catastrophic bushfires that ravaged that country in January of last year. And just to drive this point home even more, this is a map of the highest maximum temperature recorded in Australia during December 2019. And this entire dark brown area, which must account for close to 2/3 of the continent, on at least one day in December 2019, experienced air temperatures above 45 degrees. This is a really severe heat wave. Okay, so this brings us back to the birds, for which we have good data on the effects of hot weather. And I'm going to finish things off by just showing you a couple of slides that provide an overview of how we are linking physiological and behavioral data to projected climates and projected increases in global temperature in order to predict what the outlook for birds is going to be over the next couple of decades. The predictions I'm going to show you are all based on the assumption that greenhouse gas emissions continue along the trajectory they are currently on, and we don't see rapid and meaningful reductions in emissions in the next couple of decades. So these are worst case scenarios. Going back to these RedLock data, you'll recall that there were two important threshold temperatures here, one at 34, where daytime mass gain is equivalent to overnight mass loss, and so net 24-hour change in body mass is 0. Another one up at 40, where on average for every 24-hour cycle, the RedLocks are losing about 5% of their body mass. And what we can do is we can map the exposure of birds to these threshold temperatures under current or recent conditions in these left-hand maps and future conditions under this worst case RCP 8.5 scenario for the end of the century, in this case, the 2080s. And this top pair of graphs shows the number of consecutive days per summer on average on which birds experience this temperature under current conditions and under future conditions. And this word consecutive is really important here because we're looking at conditions where birds have to deal with sustained hot weather, and on successive days, they are losing body mass because of these trade-offs between foraging and thermoregulation. But this is the map that should really be cause for concern. So this is the number of consecutive days per summer on average on which the larks are going to be experiencing a 5% loss of body mass by the end of the century. And over the majority of the RedLocks' current range, sorry, that's what this cross-hatching illustrates. Over the majority of their range, they're going to be experiencing upwards of 10 consecutive days per summer above 40 degrees. And these are simply conditions that birds are not going to be able to persist under. No bird can handle losing 5% of body mass a day for 10 consecutive days. And so the majority of the RedLocks current range, is going to be rendered simply too hot for the birds to have any chance of persisting there. Shannon Conradi, one of my current PhD students, published a very sobering analysis 2 years back about exposure of Southern African arid zone birds to the sublethal fitness costs of sustained hot weather. In the case of southern pied babblers, you've got similar threshold temperatures. In the babblers case, the 0% change over 24-hour threshold is 35.5 degrees, and the 0 daytime mass gain, and therefore 24-hour loss of 4% of body mass, is at around 40, similar to the locks. And so this is what Shannon's modeled here, very similar to the previous figures you saw. But this is bad news right here. So on upwards of 10% of, on upwards of 10 consecutive days per summer over the Southern Kalahari, the babblers are going to be experiencing a net loss of 4% of body mass per day. And so again, as was the case with the RedLocks, large parts of the babblers range are going to be rendered too hot for them to be able to persist. And it's going to come down to portions of their range that are cooler, like this over here, in terms of ensuring the species survival into the 21st century, 22nd century, I'm sorry. Let's go back to the hornbills and their breeding success. You'll remember that 35.1 is an important temperature here, because this is the point at which breeding success on average is 50%. What Shannon has done here in this pair of maps is modeled average summer maximum temperatures under current conditions and future conditions. The color scale bar tops out at 35, and so this gray area over here is going to experience summer maximum temperatures that are averaging above 35 by the end of the century. And large parts of the range are going to be coming very close to 35. And so it's very unlikely that the birds are going to be able to persist across much of their range. Again, these small parts of the species range that is in cooler areas are going to become very important in terms of thermal refugia, where these birds can potentially persist beyond 2100 if we continue on the emissions trajectory that we are currently on. So those were a couple of examples of how temperatures are going to cause problems in terms of maintaining body mass or breeding successfully. But what about those extremely hot conditions above 40, where birds face this risk of lethal hypothermia or lethal dehydration? For birds in the Southern African arid zone, the outlook is actually not all that bad in terms of these acute lethal effects of high temperatures. We mapped data for 11 species for which we have had physiological information on water requirements at different temperatures, and for only 3 of them was there a significant risk under current conditions or by the end of the century. And so what Shannon has modeled here, again on the left, recent conditions, on the right, future conditions, is the number of days per year on which each of these species will experience a significant risk of lethal dehydration during the heat of the day. And even in the sort of most dramatic of these maps, which is the one for the Birchall starling, you're not likely to see more than about 2-3 days per year, even by the end of the century. When we look at Australia, however, a very different picture emerges. Now, the first thing I need to point out is that the top of this color bar is 100 days per year, whereas on the South African map, it was 10 days per year. And a number of Australian species are set to lose large parts of their range going forward, simply because they will be exposed to lethal dehydration conditions so frequently in areas like this. The zebra finches are an interesting case, because when we looked at this, it jumped out at us very well immediately, really, that large parts of the species range are already too hot for them to be able to, escape this risk of lethal dehydration. And we took a closer look at the Australian Bird Atlas data for zebra finches. And sure enough, populations have been declining in this northwestern corner of Australia. And in this very hot area, they are almost completely absent in summer. The occurrence in this area is strictly seasonal and only in winter. So yeah, the bottom line from this slide, which is pretty much the last one I'm going to show you, is that several Australian birds are going to be in very deep trouble because of conditions that are so hot that they're going to be facing a risk of lethal dehydration on tens of days per summer by the end of this century. Okay, these are the take-home messages. This talk's pretty much come to an end. The one take-home message I hope you draw from this is that there are many risks that hot weather poses to birds living in these hot environments, whether they're desert or more humid areas. The risks of both these chronic sublethal effects, which are less immediately obvious, but are just as consequential as these lethal effects, are going to increase substantially in the coming decades. So both of these risk categories are going to become much more problematic going forward. And then really, I think, just to summarize what I've been trying to convey, if we continue on the current emissions trajectory that we are on, and global heating involves temperature increases of 4 or 5 degrees by the end of the century, then many of the warmer regions of this planet are going to see massive losses of avian biodiversity. It's simple as that. I mean, large areas of the tropics and subtropics are going to be just too hot for many of the birds that currently live there to be able to persist in a significantly warmer world. And on that rather depressing note, I will finish off by thanking all of the organizations that made the hot birds work over the last decade possible in some shape or form, and thanking all of you for your attention. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much for that extremely insightful yet very sobering talk. Sure, it's unbelievable to see how far the Hot Birds project has come over the past decade, and how much knowledge you and your team and your colleagues have really gained when it comes to the impacts of these increased temperatures in the future, particularly for our Southern African birds. And unfortunately, the Australian counterparts seem to be under huge threat based on all of that research you shared with us tonight. If any of you would like to pose any questions to Andrew, just pop them into the Zoom Q&A box. If you are tuning in through Facebook Live, you can pop them into the comment feed on the Facebook Live video. And just a reminder to everyone, please, there is a post-webinar survey which will pop up as you exit the webinar. Please take 2 minutes just to fill that in and let us know what you thought of tonight's incredible talk by Professor Andrew McKechnie. Next week, as I said, we've got a panel of Youth Day birders coming to us in celebration of South Africa's Youth Day on the 16th of June. This panel will give you insights into the minds of South Africa's next generation of bird watchers and conservationists. So it'll be sure to leave you with a new perspective on our young birding colleagues. And we're going to now dive into some questions. I see there are quite a few popping into the Q&A box. So Andrew, I'm going to kick you off with one from Penny Abbott. Now, I mentioned that you're part of the zoology and entomology department, so I hope you can give some insights into this. But Penny is really interested in knowing, how are the insects affected by heat, and are they likely to move into the more prevalent open areas where the birds potentially won't go when temperatures get hot?
Interesting question. Look, the effects of high temperatures in some ways are going to be very similar for insects as they are to birds, mammals, or any other vertebrates. There are going to be some important differences. So, of course, in insects, your metabolic rates and so your food requirements go up with temperature. And so there's a whole suite of effects on that higher temperatures will have on insects that don't occur in so-called warm-blooded animals like birds and mammals. In terms of where the insects are going to go, I'm not sure what the sort of changes within a landscape in terms of insect distribution are going to be. But in terms of the availability of prey items for birds, I should really tell you about a very interesting experiment that Susie had a student do a couple of years back. So with all of these work with insectivorous birds, one of the questions that regularly comes up about these decreases in foraging activity during the heat of the day is whether it's simply not a reflection of reduced insect availability. Is it a genuine effect of temperature on the birds and the decisions they make based on these trade-offs between thermoregulation and foraging, or is it simply that the insects aren't there during the heat of the day and that's why they're not feeding? Well, Susie and her student devised an incredibly elegant experiment using habituated drongos at Kuruman River Reserves. They've got a population of fork-tailed drongos that are semi-habituated to observers. And what they were able to do is do this really, really interesting experiment where they would find a drongo that was sitting on a perch in a tree, and the student would stand sort of, a couple of meters in front of this tree and then throw a mealworm up into the air in front of the drongo every minute on the minute for 10 minutes or whatever it was. And then make a note of whether the drongo grabbed this mealworm out of the air or whether it ignored it. And at temperatures in the lower 30s, every single worm got caught by a drongo. But then when temperatures got closer to 40, the drongo's behavior changed, and they literally just sit there and watch this worm going up and down in front of them. And so that particular experiment was a very elegant test of whether, this reduction in foraging during the heat of the day reflects reduced insect availability or a genuine temperature effect. And it indicates very clearly that it is a genuine temperature effect on the birds.
Sure, absolutely fascinating. Now, obviously, one of the things that higher temperatures are going to potentially lead to, and I see we've got Professor Phoebe Barnard in the audience this evening. It's wonderful to have her with us. Phoebe really commends you on this absolutely fascinating talk. And she says this insight into the tussock and other microclimates used by desert birds shows the danger of the future and the role of vanishing vegetation in future decades of increasing temperatures and aridity. And she goes on to note that back in 2005, the first National Climate Science Conference, which she happened to organize, included a talk by David Thomas, who gave a keynote from Oxford showing that devegetation and remobilization of Kalahari dunes under climate change is going to come. And she's shared the link to that paper for anybody that is interested. But something that I'd like to just lead on into with that note from Phoebe is linked to a question that Leslie Cornish has asked around how likely are some of these birds to shift their distributions? And something like a red lark, which we know is very strongly associated with those red dunes and the vegetation that we find there, how at risk are these birds in terms of trying to shift their distributions into more tolerable heat islands and the vegetation responding appropriately so that they can do that?
Well, first of all, Phoebe, thanks so much for joining us tonight. It's always great to interact with you. I must say I'm really enjoying my affiliation with SANBI, but certainly not as much as I would have been had you still been on the staff there. But thanks very much for joining tonight. To answer the question, Melissa, ranges will shift to some extent, but the ability of birds to shift their ranges is often going to be constrained by what they're moving into. So, for instance, one of the questions that sometimes comes up when I talk about this stuff is, are these Kalahari birds not going to just shift southwards? And the problem is that, well, they're not really camel thorns and bosquias and all the other trees that they rely on in the Karoo, right? The other thing that gets a bit tricky is actually identifying cases of range expansions or range shifts that are really driven by higher temperatures. Phil Hockey and his co-authors looked into this about 15 years ago, and they looked at the cases in South Africa where birds have shifted their distribution south, which is of course one of the central predictions that you would make based on global heating. And what they realized was that in only one case, which if I remember correctly was the common swift, was there unambiguous evidence for a range shift southwards driven by climate change and rising temperatures. In all the other species, it was very difficult to separate the effects of temperature from the effects of increasing tree availability, increasing urbanization, and that sort of thing. So I guess the short answer here is that, yes, distributions will change. The degree to which distributions will change is constrained by a number of species-specific factors. And I think more sort of at a more philosophical level, this is one of the things about climate change that is being driven by humans. Imagine for a second that we'd all got this completely wrong, and the warming we're seeing now is not associated with our greenhouse gas emissions, but is instead a natural phenomenon. Would that mean we don't need to be concerned? It absolutely doesn't, because if you had rapid warming like this in the past, at that stage, the habitats that birds have to respond to that warming in were intact. They had these vast unbroken tracts of grasslands, forests, whatever, in which they could potentially shift their ranges southward. But the fact that they're now living in these habitats that are fragmented and chopped up and just, utterly transformed by human activities means that it is that much more difficult for them to respond to the current warming that's occurring at the moment.
Absolutely, and a really important point you make there, Andrew. As you said, we've really damaged the resilience of our natural ecosystems and the birds that rely on them. And certainly from BirdLife South Africa's perspective, we're doing our best to try and reconnect a lot of those landscapes, but it is always a challenge given how many humans continue to grow. And I remember you giving a really sobering talk at one of the Oppenheimer research conferences where you alluded to the human effect that these upper temperatures are going to bring, and people having to move southwards out of these uninhabitable hot zones of the various continents, and the challenges that that's going to bring going forward, not just for our birds, but for us as a species too. Yeah, but Tommy Curley has got a question here on Facebook Live, and he wants to know, for birds that live in these extremely hot environments, do you find that they've got shorter incubation periods because the ambient temperature is now so high? You spoke about the southern yellow-billed hornbill's fledging success, but are you seeing a reduction in incubation periods?
The data to answer that question are few and far between. I mean, it's not an aspect that we've looked at yet. He's absolutely correct. I mean, all things being equal, you would expect that higher temperatures might reduce incubation needs. Although the thing is that in these hot environments, incubation is often more about keeping eggs cool than keeping eggs warm. So Amanda Bourne has shown this very clearly in pied babblers, that incubation becomes really tricky during these hot conditions. Yeah, you would kind of expect that under cooler conditions, increases in temperature might shorten incubation times, or at least reduce the effort that the parents need to put in. Most of our work so far has really focused on what happens post-hatching, in terms of growth rates and provisioning rates and massive fledging, etc. We haven't really looked at incubation in any meaningful way yet.
Okay, well, some future research coming there, I'm sure. We've got a question here from Rob Simmons, and you alluded to the risks and the landscape of fear that these birds are operating in when it comes to avoiding heat, as well as the predators that are associated with some of these microhabitats, like the waterholes and shady spots. So Rob is asking, do you see different predation rates in the sort of underbushes versus open areas? And has anyone actually looked at that aspect of bird survival?
There's been some very nice work in the deserts of the Middle East on hoopoo larks in particular. And what the authors of that study showed very clearly is that you have this trade-off between hot conditions at exposed nest sites versus cooler conditions but higher predation risk under shade. And so what happened in that particular study was that hoopoo larks that started breeding earlier in the summer used these exposed locations far from vegetation, and most of those breeding attempts were successful. And then as summer got hotter and hotter, and as they sort of reached midsummer, the hoopoo larks started building their nests under vegetation because they really had no choice at that point. And the nest predation rate increased about 5-fold. So yeah, so that trade-off between thermal environments and predation seems to be a really real determinant behind breeding behavior of some of these desert birds.
Absolutely, and not just the desert birds. I know we've seen some really scary research by Krista Oswald on those Cape rock jumpers and the increased activity of boomslangs in the Western Cape. Certainly very concerning what's happening there. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that at all.
Yeah, look, I mean, the rock jumper study is just amazing, because it was our kind of first insight in Southern Africa into these temperature effects in cooler environments. And it's a really important study. It also kind of just reminds us that what is hot weather for a desert bird is not, or sorry, what is not hot weather for a desert bird can be hot weather for species in other environments. The rock jumpers are an example of that. You started seeing these negative effects at much lower temperatures than we do in these Kalahari birds. And then an even more spectacular example concerns a study published about 10 years ago on some species of seabird in Greenland. And basically what happened in that particular system was that the birds would start panting, the incubating parents would start panting and wing drooping and leaving the nest to go and find water at air temperatures above 14. So this is what you see in desert birds at 35. In these Greenland seabirds, it's happening at 14 degrees. And so in that case, as soon as you had these hot days above 14, the predation risk for nestlings would go through the roof because the adults were leaving the nest to go and find water to splash around in and cool down. So yeah, I mean, look, desert birds live in these hot environments. Birds that live in cooler environments, we're seeing the same sort of temperature effects just kicking in at lower temperatures.
Sure, that is absolutely fascinating, Andrew. I suppose it really does speak to the incredible diversity and adaptation that the over 10,000 bird species have shown, and the reason we see so many different birds adapting to these different niches. But certainly interesting to see how those thresholds shift depending on the environment that the birds have chosen to evolve into. I'm conscious of time, and I'm going to finish us off with one from Rob Simmons once again. And I'm very interested to hear what you have to say, given that we are going to be updating the Red Data Book for South Africa in the near future. But Rob is asking, which species might we see added to the Red Data list of South Africa, due mainly to climate change and global warming, especially direct heating, via some of the mechanisms that you've provided in tonight's excellent talk?
I've currently got a postdoc, Stephanie Payne, who's working with Susie and me. And what Stephanie is doing is developing a vulnerability index for arid-zone birds. And so she's drawn up a whole list of traits, spanning everything from the morphology of the bird to the breeding behavior to foraging behavior. And we're busy sitting down with a group of experts at the moment and trying to draw out the traits that are going to be most important. I think a lot of species are going to get added to the Red List book in future as a direct consequence of climate change. I think that future climates are going to become a very important issue in conservation planning. I think the days of conservation planning and management planning, assuming this constant climate, are over, and we really need to start thinking about these increases in temperature. I also think that in the case of things like RedLocks, you're going to see them moving up that red list as a consequence of climate change. And I certainly hope that the work we're doing at the moment is something that is taken into account in these red list assessments.
Absolutely,
so,
and yeah. No,
I mean, also just as this also just speaks to the importance of BirdLife's Keeping Common Birds Common program. With the hornbills and the babblers and so forth, they are likely to lose such large parts of their current range. And before we know it, species that are dirt common could become restricted to much smaller areas.
Absolutely, and your figure of those fruit bats, a third of their population being wiped out in 2 days, certainly puts shivers down my spine. And I definitely don't want to live in a world where our common birds become the threatened ones and our threatened birds are likely no longer around. So, Andrew, I'm going to wrap us up there. There are so many questions still to answer, and I will provide all of these to you if you have the time to email the various people that have taken the time to write them. All that's left to do is really just to say a massive thank you to you. This was an unbelievable talk, definitely one of the top ones on the series. So thank you so much for the effort you put into that fascinating lecture, and certainly one that we will all exit with quite a bit to chew on. So thank you so much for taking the time to do that. And I don't know if you have any last comments before we shut things down this evening.
No, just thank you again for the opportunity to talk this evening. And as I said, I think you guys are doing a fantastic job with this webinar series, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and we look forward to having more of your team in future, showing some of the incredible research that they are undertaking. And please do give my regards to Stephanie Payne, who spent many years alongside me at WITS. So I'm glad to see she's left pollination and doing some bird work. But a good night to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll leave the chat room open for a couple of minutes if you'd like to leave Andrew any comments. But thank you all so much. Remember, join us next week for our Youth Day panel. It's going to be something a little bit different and a lot of fun. So thank you for spending another Tuesday night with us. And please do stay safe out there. Keep those eyes on the skies and keep enjoying our birds. And let's hope all the common ones stick around for years to come. Good night, everybody, and stay safe.